Did you hear the birds today? They're already bringing some good news, I think. And there's a few other good news coming. As soon as the birds sing, then something grows. I think it's only partly the light, it's mostly the sound. They're called, the growth is called. Yeah. Who calls you? Who calls you to grow? Yeah. Light by itself is not enough. We need the call. So thank you very much for coming this evening. And so the theme is color, sound, and consciousness. It's always a journey of comparisons, I think. We've all got our own ideas, and then we need a little bit of comparison now and again. It's the same sheet music. Life is the same sheet music, but the way that we interpret it and the way that we play it on our different instruments, that makes it interesting. So let's have a meditation to get our connection. If we stand near the Arctic Circle at this time, on a clear night where the moon is not too full, the aura of the Masters, as some describe it, shows itself. And the beautiful wave-like rhythmic expression of the Northern Lights, as it is experienced, it's not just a witness, it's an experience. It works upon us, and in some way life is changed for always. For these are the events when light and the way that on special moments light translates into a movement of color, into a rhythm of its unfoldment, and you cannot predict it. And what good is a photograph but a mere reflection? But the experience enters in, we enter into it. And in these moments, it is as if there is a chorus from the universe. There is music that works upon us beyond our hearing. And there is light which translates into colors that confirm what is the essence of our prayers and our hopes and the depth of our meditations. For color and sound into consciousness brings these sparkles from a higher level, from cosmic space perhaps. These sparkles that enter and are never diminished, but are always present, that are cumulative, that gather, that unite, and at certain moments that fill us. And these moments are for always, for they belong to the continuity, and when at a certain moment they reach their completeness even, there is no death, for we are joined within the flow of the light that anchors life to life, level to level, awareness into an expanding consciousness of itself, awareness which enters into the refinement of its own perception. These are new times. However much we use these words without knowing enough, these are new times. For we stand upon a foundation which is now clear and strong. The dimensions are awake. Or perhaps we are more awake within their reality. At first these are only intimations of awareness. And we draw upon the poets and the philosophers and the idealists. And we are challenged by those who cannot explain what cannot be measured. But all begins to come together, and none is complete by itself. And color, and sound, and consciousness, and continuity, and memory that embraces perspectives that we have not yet discovered, but we feel them, ideas that we do not know how to relate, but we feel uplifted nonetheless. For we enter more into the presence of a universal beingness. Perhaps this is only measured by the day, sufficient for the day. Sometimes perhaps it is only measured within the moment, and it is an extraordinary moment. And yet, life expands within the moment of its happening, and we are here because of it, whether we know it or not. But we are here because it is time, a new expression in the nature of the mind and the heart, a new experience within the consciousness of being, a new understanding that draws us into its own language. And this is a language that we know because it is familiar, but we don't speak it quite so well yet because it has been a while. And yet it is the language of our home, of our belonging, but also the language of our destiny. And so we link to these thoughts for a moment as we anchor our atmosphere for the evening. Okay. Okay, this is the story. Just a story. But in order for conception to occur, there must be an anchor from the center of the earth to that space which is behind the bone we call the sacrum, the sacred bone. And there we have the most forceful force of all forces, some describe it. We use the Sanskrit term of Kundalini because it is like the coiled flame or the coiled serpent. But it generates, it's the generator. Life doesn't happen if it is not active. It can become more active, and it can also become undisciplined in its activity. But until there is the anchoring to the earth from the base, which is in a way the point of conception, there is no conception. And then, until there is that movement within the minutest microscopic sense, where the design, that is the etheric design, begins to work upon the cell division, and there is that sense of very gentle expansion, and the principle of the crown is anchored to the base of the spine. At that moment, the soul connects with the conception. And then the new life really begins. There are many conceptions which do not reach the point where the soul connects, and they come and go quite frequently. And then there are conceptions which do anchor, but also not for long, because many souls are very experienced and they only need to touch the earth, even for a few moments sometimes, perhaps just for a few months. It's not necessary for so many children to be conceived and so many children to be born, and for the infant mortality to be so high as it was in the, I don't know, forever, in the 19th century and part of the 20th century, and even now in certain areas. We could say that to touch the earth can be far more subtle and far less complex, in fact. And then also there is a conception where there is a union of energies, even without the physical conception. But the bonding between two souls is so strong and so complete within its different levels of exchange. And then there are souls that incarnate at an etheric level, directly. And we can have our children that never need even to be biologically conceived. There is certainly a certain amount of management of this from the higher worlds. And it is interesting to see when we look energetically, sometimes, you can see that the soul has created their own conception, and the parents are a little bit surprised to have a child when after a few years perhaps nothing has happened, or they thought that was it. Now, as this begins to work and generate, so then the history of yesterday comes in, and it creates a kind of a historical fog or shadow along the spine. It's the unfinished business. You know, where is it? Is it in our unconscious, subconscious, deep subconscious? Is it sort of hanging around in the atmosphere, the whole world situation and all of that? What we don't always appreciate is that at the collective level, history has no time. It has occurred sometime, but if it is here, it is now. And there is a lot of unfinished business that is finished, but it hasn't been cleared. And there is a lot of unfinished business that is not relevant, but it's around, and we can't shut it out. And there is a lot of volumes of images, accumulations of frustrations, and also very difficult areas that we would have thought of as being like in the lower astral areas, that have just not been transformed or cleansed. And they should have been or could have been. And this creates not a resistance so much, but almost like a dampener on the way in which the energy can flow through the centers and through the spine. Our centers anyway are more active and more open than ever. Our centers tend to function more collectively than individually, so that the base and the second chakra function very much in synthesis, but also the solar plexus anchors the first and second and third chakras very strongly. It's like one center. And as the heart opens, so then the heart gradually begins to embrace the first three chakras more and more. It's a subtle, but it's a very definite process. And we are no longer so subject to the compulsions we could say the unconscious forces that motivate. Our own higher motivation or heart-centered motivation can drive this, as it were. You put your foot on the accelerator, but you can also steer, and you can also put your foot on the brake as well. And this changes the nature of experience. We don't need so many rules and regulations. We can take a little bit of poison in a certain dose, and it will awaken us, or it will clear, or stimulate, or cleanse. And we can go into, you could say, the dark side, but only just so far, just so much. Because these are all a part of the powers that when they are managed, if not mastered, they are at least managed, are the fossil fuel, the comparative, in a comparative sense, they are the fuel that frees us from gravity. We need everything, but we don't need it in toxic doses. And when the energy comes up also into the throat center, you get quite a strong synthesis between the second chakra and the throat center. These are creative centers. And this is where within ourselves we enter into this masculine, feminine synthesis. And we find the fine balance of our own, we say, our own creative potential, the way in which our own creative potential can be plugged in to the resources that are there in nature and in life, and in certain parts of the earth very strongly. And then, of course, we come into the head centers, and here there is an enormous momentum taking place between the two major glands in the brain and the crown. And, of course, we find that it flows in different ways. We can imagine if you drop a stone in the pond, it goes out. And if you drop a stone in the base chakra becomes the center of the whole system. If you drop a stone in the second chakra, then it's the orange center that becomes the center. And all the impulses go out. If you create the center in the solar plexus, that becomes the center of the whole chakra system and the whole center of our consciousness. And so with each one can be as a center to all the others. Or they can all become one-pointed, and then literally from the center of clear and pure transparent light, each one is awakened and stimulated and opened and so on. It can also unfold in a spiral sense, as if we could start in the heart and, at least in a linear way of looking at a spiral, it can unfold, it can unfold, it can unfold. We can work with this in meditation. Maybe we will do it later. But as much as we can go from the center, we can also go from the crown to the base. We can also go from the base to the crown. And if we say that all these rhythms are simultaneous processes, at least in a momentary sense, every center is the center of all, and all the different ways in which the spirals can occur are occurring. That there is no one way just because logically we think it should happen somehow, but it is sequential. And in the same way that you can have along a cable, I mean, I don't know what happens with microwaves in space where they don't bump into each other, but they don't very often. But even on a fiber optic cable, you can have many thousands of simultaneous conversations along the same strand of crystal, and they don't bump into each other. You know, there's space. There's a lot of space between subatomic particles and the way that they condense to form even as they form atoms and molecules, huge things in comparison. Even when we look into what is inside a molecule, what is inside an atom, what is inside a proton, electron, neutron, what is inside that, There's enormous spaces there anyway. So there is space for everything without the limitation of quantity and without concern for volume, because as we change frequency, one space interweaves, or we could say it interpenetrates another space. But in fact, it doesn't penetrate it at all. It's present within the same concept of space, but at such a completely different frequency, and the one does not necessarily know of the presence of the other at all. There are many particles which pass right through the earth, and we have to set up very expensive equipment to try and measure them. And when we've measured them, we'll find that they are not the end, but they are probably the end of doubt and the beginning of something quite remarkable. Now, what is interesting also when we look at this, because this is so well understood, and so we say each person has a guardian angel, you know? Somebody is assigned to everybody, and it's not so much that they got to live wonderful lives or terrible lives or anything. They're assigned to the incarnation under whatever the circumstances. But when you look energetically, every child meets their guardian angel directly. They see them, they hear them, they feel them. They are impregnated into their cellular substance by this. And this link with the guardian angel is our connection into a higher level of culture, a higher civilization, a higher order of being. We call them angelic beings. I think it's associated with many ideas which need now to be updated. And we could say that's a higher level of civilization. They live in a different stage of expression. They are filled with a level of relationship to the laws and to the responsibilities of creation. But we could say they live a very good life. I don't know how we compare it with what we would call it going to Hawaii or listening to the whales or the dolphins, or just enjoying a reasonable amount of security. In a certain higher octave, they live a very good life and are very much involved in cosmic relationships and cosmic purposes. And they are the masters of light into form. They are the masters of sound into form. And they are the managers of the energies that are so interwoven, interrelated with the history of mankind, as much as with the forces of volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis and just the weather. And this is very much involved with, of course, how life finds its expression within the continuous variation of the simultaneous activity of every variety and kind that is under the heading of interdependence. Now, what occurs as we observe it is that the angelic presence connects us into the higher levels. It's not at a level that is in ordinary consciousness, but what is ordinary consciousness, you know? We're plugged in. We may not be able to download, but maybe we're gradually learning to load ourselves into the higher levels. But they are the guardians of the purpose of why we are here, of what is our life path, and the way in which the potential of this is then literally like a shaft of light is planted deep into the Kundalini, into the base chakra, into the area, the sacred area. Our life plan is held there. And it is this that almost is like what we call a time release capsule. Now, of course, it's related to our workshop upstairs. It's continuously unfolded, but once the crown and the base are connected and the body is developed and there is the first breath And then, not too long afterwards, there is this very powerful presence. And it's when a child sees and hears totally spontaneously and appreciates in a totally integrated way and remembers outside of the pathways of the brain. But it is anchored, the seed of life is anchored within the base of the spine, within the Kundalini. Now, in these times, we then see that there is a dissolving of historical shadows. Now, what does this really mean? Even if we look over the last 25 or 30 years at what is available in our reading in bookshops, and we find that when Ronald Beasley began his work, which was at the time of Alice Bailey writing her books, maybe she began a little bit before the war, but certainly after. It was at a time when even in anthroposophy they were starting to repair the big struggle that took place after the passing of Rudolf Steiner. And it's a time when many very fine teachers manifested, and a great deal of ideas became much more available for anybody and everybody. So that with the diminishing of, we could say, of the authority of churches and religions, it's not to say the diminishing of authority was a rejection. Not at all. But our society was not so much based upon the church or the mosque or the temple being very central in the community. It had become much more an aspect of the communities, somewhat peripheral. And at this time, the collective knowledge, the way in which the light and the color that comes through different nations and peoples and groups began to be available for everybody. And then it's interesting to see where we are drawn. Many people have been drawn to Tibetan Buddhism since the Dalai Lama has been such an extraordinary universal example. But many people also have been drawn to the we could say the foundation of Christianity through Desmond Tutu and his setting up at the end of apartheid a truth and reconciliation situation where people who had tried to destroy each other could begin to talk to each other, confess to each other, and ask for understanding, if not forgiveness. It's also a time when so many people have been able to work with a recognition of something that strikes a chord within themselves, somewhere. Now we could say there's good and less good in this, but it doesn't even matter what is less good. It's that it strikes a chord, and many people then have gone deeply into Native American tradition, African tradition, the mystical sides within the Kabbalah or in Sufism, Dervish, and the many interesting areas within the Hindu tradition with yoga and then all of the Chinese traditions with Chinese medicine, Chinese philosophy, and the methods of bringing energy through the body in Tai Chi and Qigong. And so we know about this. We recognize it in a certain way, that we go to these places on our holidays. Their teachers come here dressed up in their own fancy dress, and we study with them and listen to them. And it's exciting and interesting. Now, this altogether creates a path that is using all the traditions, but it's not a traditional way of working with them. And many people are using their spirituality, which is all the colors and flavors and sounds of how God speaks to man, how man transforms or translates or imagines the Creator. And so we make together our own faith, our own religion, our own kind of tradition out of other traditions. And this is open to criticism in one way, because where's the foundation? But the foundation is no longer external, it's inside the individual. It's working somewhere through the relationship of our primary purpose of life, the seed of life, the seed atom of our life perhaps. And if we then imagine that so much of this, it follows less and less an outward master in this subjective or submissive way. It may be inspired by outer masters and teachers, for sure. But there is less and less of a giving away of our own, less and less of a need to give away of our own power and the power of choice. And much more an exchange that respects the higher authority of another, but actually takes responsibility more and more within ourselves. And out of this comes a world culture that does not have a denomination and that does not have a name that can identify to one source. It is in communication spontaneously and haphazardly in a certain way of looking. And yet the lives of everyone that is working with meditation, with contemplation, with the disciplines of the body, with their voice, with movement, with art, with music, and with philosophy which seeks to open to a transcendental philosophy, with methods of health and healing that take the best of science in one way, but absolutely work into the way that the intelligence and consciousness of the body itself can be supported and appreciated. All of this creates a certain resonant consistency, we say. It is as if, Ronald Beasley used to talk about it as spiritual rain that falls upon the earth, but mostly there have been such dense clouds that it cannot get through very often, it cannot get through consistently. And yet within the last, certainly since the last 30 years, probably more than anything, maybe a little bit longer, there's gradually been a stronger and stronger resonance, stronger and stronger consistency. There is a sense of holding the light between people that can then hold the light as it can come through in its stronger vibrations. Now, when light comes in at a stronger vibration, it activates through the Kundalini receptivity, because that's what holds the spine in its ability to function throughout itself. It then enters in and touches the frequency within every chakra center at their core, at their essence. And then we get the raising of the octave, or the raising of the frequency within every center. Or traditionally we think of the 7 colors, but they actually become open at an octave beyond their everyday measurement. And all of this is very subtle. It works in a very gentle way. It has been held within what we call this cosmic engineering process, so that it does not create instability. Because you cannot switch a light on where there is not enough preparation amongst the people who are there for what they are going to see. Because the light that is switched on shows hope, and it shows a lot of other things which we have successfully ignored. It shows everything. And the light that shows hope may be just as frightening as showing the darker side of human nature and man's inhumanity. If anybody exhibits special gifts they become a target in a way if they become too visible too quickly. Harry Edwards was a very wonderful pioneer in just healing. I think he was one of the foundations of the National Federation of Spiritual Healers. Ronald Beasley and Harry Edwards were all there together in the early days and everything. And on one occasion, somewhere in Europe or in the Mediterranean, he gave a healing demonstration in an area where people were still very much in superstition, really. They were very strongly in their own religion, but we could say at a sort of a semi-mystical, but actually rather superstitious level. And as people began to heal, you know, because where there's such an atmosphere, it's very powerful, and the phenomena of healing can be quite dramatic. But then suddenly everybody wanted to be healed, and only those, you know, some people are ready and some are not. And he was demonstrating it. He wasn't opening the clinic. And then they began the intense emotion that was awakened in everybody. They all rushed at him. He had to be smuggled out. And it's difficult. And when even today there are phenomena with psychic surgery, especially from the Philippines, it's the best known, but also from Brazil. But there are people here and in Europe. And there's always a desire to discredit it in case it works too well. And there are those who seem to include a little bit of, we could say, doubtful choices and practices, even though the work still works very well. But when these phenomena occur and they take us a little bit more into the light of what is possible, it creates distrust, fear, suspicion, and it's easier to call it the work of the devil than that the Creator and the invisible world can show us a few things and keep us from becoming too crystallized. So you cannot switch the light on too easily, but you can begin to prepare everybody very gently and perhaps not so gently always, but you can begin to prepare them until there is sufficient consistency. And then we say, this creates not entirely the interdimensional area to be safe and sure, because it isn't. There's some really Wild West activities. But there are far more consistent entry points between the higher dimensions and this dimension. There are schools of teaching, interdimensional schools of teaching. There are places of healing that work. Our color therapy is inspired from these levels. And most of the color work, you know, as Pam will tell you much better than me, really, occurs in sleep state and occurs with the surgeons of light and the doctors of light. And then we get a level of consistency where the frequencies of light that can enter in can gradually intensify and increase. And this is what's happening now. That's why, as it enters in, we get the way in which the spine can be cleansed. And for a long time we have looked at areas in people's energy fields of the sins of the fathers that are visited upon the children for 7 generations or something. Now, we see this being cleansed, and the cleansing of it is a form of anti-gravity. It begins to dissolve, and it begins to change the nature of our anchoring to the center of the earth, and the way in which gradually with time and with age there is a sense of contraction, crystallization and fixation. It begins to alter these tendencies. Our bodies are not meant to degenerate. It's a hopeful thought anyway. they do not need to degenerate. They can mature and then they can regenerate and maintain this regeneration until, if you like, as a few of the great initiates, they have ascended, we say. They have ascended. Their bodies have been refined enough. Others have just dissolved into light. Some say that the body of the Christ, the physical body of the Christ, was so pure that it dissolved and went into the etheric body of the earth and uplifted the whole of the earth. I love all these stories, and I like the fact that we can't prove them until we get to a much higher level, and then perhaps proof is not the right description of what we will discover. But certainly our physical bodies start to vibrate at a frequency of light that begins to lift them out of the level of many diseases. Diseases always have a certain frequency. And if you've ever worked with radionics, then they give a number to every disease. And then if you want to work to balance it, so you find the equivalent number. And if we want to look into descriptions of homeopathic medicine, then we find we're working absolutely with equivalents that change the nature of our receptivity, and which also means change the nature of what we don't receive. And in this sense, a lot of diseases should start to minimize, and now we should find in the degenerative conditions like HIV/AIDS that within the next, I would call it the next few years, not very long, we should start to find answers. And the tendency to create this condition should diminish. It should just diminish. It's not that medicine will find the cure at this level. It means that as we raise the level of vibration, so we raise the level of the interface between the body that cannot sustain itself anymore, that has no immune system that works, and a body that the word immune system is no longer sufficient description. It's regenerative system. It's not just counteracting viruses and bacteria, but it actually changes the frequency. And when you look into the bloodstream and you look at the contents of the bloodstream in different ways, it's possible to see that what is a parasite can actually change into some other form that is actually can contribute. And what are all these different types of substances in the blood which tend to feed off us at one level or deteriorate the vitality of the blood in another way? When our own frequency changes, so does theirs. If you treat them with medicines, you can certainly reduce their intensity because most of them migrate out of the bloodstream. Others just change their nature so that they no longer are affected by our medicines. And then they come back again and they've changed again, just enough, so the medicines are even less effective. So the medicines are fine in a temporary way. It's not to argue against that, but to appreciate that there are factors within our own bloodstream, our own system, that tend to corrupt us, that are, if you like, at a certain stage, a pathological measurement of disease. But in fact, as our own vibrational frequency raises, their nature changes as well. And that what was working against us works for us. Now, we're really working with transmutation, or the potential of different life forms that at one level would feed off us as if we were the host, would then become very symbiotic, would live with us and contribute as much as we provide a certain basis and home for them. We share our lives. We breathe the air and we drink the water and everything. We work with the transformation of food into our own vibration. You know, what does that do? It doesn't just keep us alive, it certainly keeps us going, but it also works upon the transformation of the whole of the earth. Everything must pass through something, someone, somewhere. The whole of the earth has to pass through stomachs at some point. Or sufficient of the whole of the earth has to pass through that the frequency of life can be raised. And this is a state we then say of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness. It doesn't mean we're a state of being able to speak and read and write, but it's a state of a harmonic relationship within the creative process that tends, in working for its own growth, tends to also support the growth of other life forms. Does not work in one way to its own advantage and in another to the disadvantage of something else. Now, the world is full of all kinds of malevolent influences, and people do successfully represent them deliberately and willfully, we could say. At the same time, everything has its place. And if we are raising the frequency now of light, changing the nature of actually our perception of light, so that at the moment we are in a 7-color spectrum, but in fact within those 7 colors there are extraordinary amounts of tones and shades, but perhaps actually our light spectrum receptivity is expanding. Now, it doesn't mean we've got to see ultraviolet and infrared and exactly, but maybe it's expanding not laterally, but frequentially. But the frequency is not into areas that are destructive to our life. The frequency is into higher octaves of what we already see. But the seeing is also being seen by, or as some might say, we are being fed by light. We are being nourished by the new colors that come in beyond the visible spectrum. At the moment, all the light and all the colors are in our food. And we eat them. And there's a lot of good nutrition in just color-coded eating. There's a lot of good nutrition also in breathing in color and meditating in color. And then, as what we call the light spectrum receptivity expands, we begin to take in the higher frequencies, or the interdimensional light, or the 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th dimensional light. And then, what does this mean? Because the relationship of consciousness to the purpose of our existence frees the pathway of self-fulfillment, or awakens the pathway of enlightenment, if we use that word a little bit, hopefully. It also changes the nature of how we radiate and how we correspond. Now, always when the light spectrum expands, for our visual receptivity to expand, we cannot be alone in seeing. We must also be able to see through others, with others. And so there is, for example, this evening, there's a collective perception of our time together. Much more than in 30 years ago, I'm suggesting. That even as we look here, and it's me looking at you, and you looking at us, and everything, in fact, we are all experiencing more than we can measure, perhaps, but certainly more than we have perhaps even imagined. My perception is very much involved with the perception of everyone else. Everyone is involved with the perception of everyone else. And if we talk about the expansion of our light and color receptivity spectrum, but in this kind of interdimensional sense, what's happening with sound? What's happening with the very basis that sound is cohesion? The wrong sound can destroy, or it can unattract, as it were. And harmonic sound will tend to bring together that which belongs, but also free that which does not belong, but not aggressively, but very disciplined nevertheless. Now, what happens when the sound spectrum also expands? Our receptivity to sound changes. So sound and light enter the cells of the body directly. We've got our organs and we've got our brain centers which translate the impulses and signals. But what happens if the whole body starts to register far more intensively light and sound, or light, color and sound? And what we call then an expansion of perception to see, an expansion of listening to hear, a fuller spectrum of experiencing life, our whole body becomes a big eye and a big ear and a big everything, perhaps. But certainly it becomes far more light and sound receptive to the vibrations that hold the world together, or balance the weather, or work with the nature of economics, and also work with the concern for the welfare of those who cannot care enough for themselves, and creates a space for children and families and communities to work with both the social support and also the social misdemeanor, crime and punishment, and all of that. It changes the nature of looking at a situation, and the situation becomes apparent from many points of view. And the polarization of judgment and of decision making diminishes. And the kind of what we call then the universality of being able to live and exchange our ideas and talk about our differences, it does not too easily or as easily become a military exercise. Because you could say at the moment there is a plan for the West to destroy the military establishment of Iran and of North Korea, very definitely. There are plans anyway for everybody to blow up everybody else, but specifically in the areas that disturb the great powers, you can be sure that there is already plans to use the most terrible weapons. Now, then there are all the vested interests. And what is quite interesting also, as we could say the light intensifies and the spectrum of color and sound becomes more interdimensional, it becomes also awakening the whole body. It also creates the sense of an increasing sharing, or an increasing form of synthesis, that as you see, I see a little of what you see. You see a little of what I see. Now, in consciousness, this becomes a state of tolerance in a way. Less intolerance, certainly. And a willingness to listen, because the person who is listening is also a little bit of the other person who is talking. And it's quite fascinating to begin to appreciate this, that the enemies sit around a table and inside every enemy is every other. You know, the enemies are all inside each other, so who is talking to who? Because when we look at the darkness that is there recently in the Middle East, that there is a group which refuse to recognize Israel, and Israel cannot negotiate with a group which is doing everything from a very weak position in one way to destroy it. It's a strange situation. But when you look at the darkness behind it, it's the same darkness behind both forces. The choices that make the military decisions in Israel and the choices that make the military decisions of Hamas both self-justify politically and whatever, but in fact, it's the same shadow. It's doing a very successful job. And if we raise it a frequency, then this is the point really, as it was raised a frequency which is virtually inevitable, I would like to say, Because when we look in the eyes of the children in these countries, on a good day, we could say, when there's no bad news suddenly, we don't see a future of conflict. They don't have conflict in their eyes. They don't have conflict in their energy fields. They don't. So what do they have and why? Because when you look at the situation, you could say, there's no solution until everybody is wiped off the planet or something, or until Barack Obama becomes the president of the Middle East or something, you know, where we get some great figure, but there's no great figure. There is the way in which we could say each one begins to look and listen to the other, and they've got a little bit of the other inside them, not just a historical factor of their roots come from the same root. And there are all the differences and all the ideologies. There's a little something else there that just says, maybe we'll make a 3-year break in trying to destroy each other. We'll agree on that. And then in that 3-year break, you know, they might forget why they wanted to destroy each other. They can still remember why they didn't like each other, but they might forget why they want to dislike each other at a military level. They can dislike each other on, you know, on the football field, or playing tennis, or trading and trying to gain advantage, and whatever. So, and there's a lot of interest now in Islam. There's some very interesting scholars who are looking at the level of science and the application of science within Islam, because all our Western science, and actually all our Western philosophy, really, pretty much, came through the very earliest days of Islam. The cultures for the centuries that followed its origin were hungry for knowledge from wherever it came, in whatever language, and they recorded it, they translated it, they disseminated it. And the great souls from that time then reincarnated, and they were the great souls in Europe, Francis Bacon and you could say even the Goethes and the great philosophers and great artists. They were all there in the early days of Islam, and then they've brought it to the West as well as it has filtered in. And then for centuries, the scientific side was diminished. And now, when you look at the number of universities that teach it, it's very little. And when you look at the number of Islamic scholars that have had the Nobel Prize for Science, it's very minimal than all of that. And there is a movement there. And so what does that mean? To me, listening to that, it's as if they begin to see through the eyes of the world. And the world begins to see a little bit more through their eyes. And so the story, and then I think Hillary Clinton is going to Indonesia. She's there now, I think. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country on the planet. But it is not a militant Islam. It's not a radical Islam, not in the main. It's just Islam, it's their faith, and they live in a very interesting and exciting and progressive way. It's an extraordinary culture of how many different fragments and so on. Now, she's going there in a way, what will she experience? What will be her contact from that, you know, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and the biggest country, biggest Islamic country on the planet, and whose eyes will see what and how, and what will come back, and how will it enter into our culture and so on. So it's very interesting to observe this, and then as the frequency of light enters in, there is no space between yesterday and tomorrow. There's no clearing out the old and then bringing in the new. the old is the new. The one gives life to the presence of the other. The new cannot come in until the old is in sufficient form that it can nourish it, or it can anchor it. Gravity is a very fine force. It's not a very, in its measurement, it's very subtle, but it's extraordinarily powerful. And when we work to find the point of balance between what we call time and presence. Presence is in a certain way of being in the moment, being in the now. Time is constantly the flow of events and the ever changing nature of existence. But presence is always present within the ever-changingness. And this creates both the point of stillness and the movement that can flow through that point, that allows what we call the interdimensional reality to manage and gradually support the self-mastering of the material reality, where we are. Now, we then find that light into the color spectrum changes within the intensity of its action. Okay, what does that mean? As the frequency within our chakra centers spins at a more subtle but also a more powerful level, and that the power is not the awakening of special spiritual gifts or psychic powers or anything, but the power is the combination of all the centers together, empowering the pathways of the light of the soul. More than anything. There's plenty of time to awaken our siddhis, our gifts, our spiritual abilities. It's much more to change the nature of the relationship of the soul in the incarnation to gravity, which changes the nature of our presence within time. Now, what does this really mean? Because we are created within the frequencies of light. This is our nature. Each chakra center anchors its own aspect of the spectrum. And each works upon all the others. Now we would say red is the slowest moving. It tends to stabilize everything else. But red also represents the most forceful force. So it tends to empower and give the right, if you like, to life, to everything else. But it cannot act upon its own. So that when we come into the orange color, it literally lifts us. The gravity through the orange is lighter and gentler than in the red. The gravity through the yellow is lighter and gentler than the orange and the red. The gravity within the green begins to uplift us as we come to the central point within the spectrum. The gravity within the blue and the indigo and the violet is like an anti-gravity. Or it's like what we call the magnetic induction, where you can float on gravity because you've got the two opposing south poles or the two opposing north poles. And literally, if you try to put two of the same poles of the magnet together, it's a very interesting feeling. Now, this in a not a dramatic way, but in a subtle and very definite way, is beginning to work through the energies of the spine and through the way in which literally color works upon itself and through its own spectrum. So that we find that literally the spectrum of light, as it works, we could say in a more synthetic way. The word synthetic doesn't sound quite right, does it? But more synthesized, more unified, or more aligned perhaps. And that this happens because the light flowing through the spine is the light of the seed of our life, why we are here, what we have come to do. It's this light that is there. And then literally, the lower centers begin to balance themselves in time and in gravity. The heart center finds the point of equilibrium between one dimension and another, really, between one state of experience and another. And then the higher centers, from the throat to the crown, literally work so that we have what we call magnetic induction in a way. We have two north poles and two south poles alternating perhaps, but at the same time always the two poles are facing just enough so that there's a sense of upliftment, there's a sense of freedom, there's a sense of expansion. Now, this is a principle which, when we work with our sound work, and we work with the still point in the brain, which we call the master still point, and we anchor it through the spine, activates the still point in every single cell of the body, which means the balance between gravity, time, and presence is unified. And the effect of crystallization and the nature of aging begins to change. Now, part of the problem with some diseases much more than others, and definitely the problem with aging, and especially with dementia and Alzheimer's, is the loss of the function of the cell, the loss of the actual ability of a cell to function according to its information and its design. And if this is held at a better level than ever before, is this the kind of elixir of life in a way? But if we are working with the still point in the brain that works anchored through the spine, and it is like in the same moment, active within every single cell of the body, so that the sense of balance between expansion and contraction is more generous, if you like. It allows the reason of life, the actual information that we say is in the workshop of the soul, and now we say it's in the 9th chakra. Now, but we also say that it is anchored in the Kundalini, in the base of the spine, through our guardian angel, when we are still very tiny babies. Very deliberately, very consciously to that baby, not in our level of consciousness as we grow. And that this now is awakened. It's the purpose of our life belongs to the balance between time and presence. And so there's a sense of being in the moment, there's a sense of being not exactly enlightened with full realization, but in the light, a little bit more, or more lightly. And that the nature of our perception is expanded, but in another way than our logical mind might imagine. And the nature of receptivity to sound is more resonant. And we become more strongly as an individual, because we are less polarized into our own lack of seeing and hearing. It's interesting to think about this, isn't it? It's quite a powerful impulse, really. And where shall we go with it? What shall we do with it? From our point of view here, we look for indicators. We begin to look around in the world, and we want to see where is the change resisted the most, and where is the change that has been very resisted beginning to diminish. So we could say in the United States, with the election of Barack Obama, something happened which Wonderful. Oh, okay. Where are you going to put it? I know.
That file.
No,
Marvellous, thank you.
it's all right. I'd like to help you sometime. Even more.
There you go.
There you go. You can't resist. Okay, thanks ever so much.
You're very welcome.
We look for, in the areas where it has been so resisted, how it might be diminishing. And then we see Barack Obama, and we see that something has happened there. And the whole world is proud of themselves. And everybody in America is proud of themselves, even if they don't want him and they want to see him evaporated. They're still secretly very proud that they could achieve something like that. And so now there are people going to all the corners of the earth who actually have not got vested interests in any area that is so obvious to us. Maybe they've got vested interests. But the oil and the armaments and the pharmaceuticals and the businesses that use everybody for their own profit are not quite so dominant. The people who represent them are not in ascendance. In a strange way, our bankers appear to us to be amongst the most irresponsible people who have been given the trust of the ordinary people. We've given them our trust, and they have been untrustworthy, unreliable, and it's absolutely visible. And we also see that as this takes place, as Barack Obama has, I've heard him say, we cannot afford to be reliant on oil for our power and energy. We must develop other methods, and we must be able to be self-sufficient without being held to ransom and so on. Now, of course, that's never been less than absolutely obvious, but there's never been enough space to be able to bring another, to create problems that we haven't had. I'm sure our progress will create lots of problems in itself, but at least we can progress beyond the repetition of what is so familiar for forever. Now, these are all interesting indicators. Even in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe has been blessed with eternal life, I think, he has allowed his enemy to begin to enter into the government. And there's a level of intelligence and generosity that amongst the opposition that is an example, I think, to the whole world. So we see a subtle change there. Now, in a moment, of course, the embargo of Cuba will go down. I don't know how much good it will do to Cuba, actually. But nevertheless, that will dissolve and become history. And and then we begin to see, at least from the way in which we would look at it here, what will happen to the areas of international crime, under whatever headings it goes. It doesn't matter what it's called or what they do or anything. But there is a culture that lives in the bloodstream of mankind that are parasites. Just the same as there is in the bloodstream of mankind all these different life forms. And we can successfully try to deal with the illegal this and the illegal that. Not so easy. But in the same way that our bloodstream begins to change because of the change of frequency within our light presence, light sound receptivity, so the very parasites in our bloodstream become symbiotic in some way. Now, this sort of parallel level of international exploitation of human beings, of women, of children, of all kinds of substances which if we could use them properly, we'd probably have a place, but we don't know how to use them properly, and so on and so on. So now we look to see whether this parasitic aspect of mankind, what will be the remedies? Because at the moment, there's an enormous amount of policing and everything. An enormous amount. And actually, the going through the airport now, they start to have a way of checking your one person in a million could carry a bomb, so they can't take a chance. One cell in the body can lose its information. The whole of the body can die as a result of that, given a certain process. So, of course, we are working in the same way. You can't take a chance. But the sophistication of the machinery that can check you and check your bags becomes much more efficient. And if you've got one of the latest passports, you don't need to go. You just put it in the machine, and it checks the photograph with you, and it also checks the whatever it is, that electronic tag, and you just go through. You don't have to see anybody. And in a moment, it could get more sophisticated. But the very things which terrorism is engendering may be its own demise in the process. Because at a certain moment, the very forces which tend to live off society will be unable to resist the change within their own relationship to society. Now, what's going to happen, So, at least it's interesting to place this as an image and to see where it might lead us. Yeah, so I thought, we could do all sorts of things with color this evening and everything, but I thought the ideas are so interesting, and it's a story, as I said, which is there to share with your story, and then we want to see what's happening in the world, and then we look with a certain measure of expectation, actually. We've been working with the color since forever. It feels like forever. And initially it was anchored in White Lodge. Ronald Beasley was the interdimensional research station. And as it has been perfected during that research process, it's now inspiring many people in many different ways everywhere. But our work is anchored. The color and the light is the center of the White Lodge work. And then the sound has sort of manifested through that in a lovely way. And then here we are, all our lives. There's a shift in the energies. There's a consistency within the whole of the earth sufficient that the higher light can enter in, and it will not disturb negatively through its brightness or through the revelation of our darkness. It's okay. The level of frequency of disease and the level of vibration within the cellular integrity of the body changes. Lots of disease will begin to diminish. And we won't need to have a medicated society. We can have a medically supported society, which can be integrated medicine and educated medicine and so on. There's a lot of interesting ideas. So we'll just have a little meditation to bring it together. Within the theme of health and happiness, the light spectrum draws us more within to its beautiful and subtle expression. And the very song of the soul, the symphony of life, the music of the spheres, it awakens as if our whole system could hear And if the very nature of our own existence could be expressed as a song, as a sound, as a radiant expression of color, and this is our name, this is our spiritual belonging, that we recognize each other through the feeling of hearing and through the sensing of color and through the experiencing of this integrity, this coming together within the moment, within the presence of the moment, within the passage of the movement of everything. It can be then that as we go forward, we are so conscious that we are as awake when our body is at rest as we can remain conscious of the higher worlds when our body is active. But what is this but the expansion of our awareness, not as an individual, but as a group that all together share their different ways, their different insights, and their different levels of understanding. In a moment, we could say mankind will see and hear sufficiently together that the earth itself will no longer need a weather forecast that will predict extremes. And the resources that go into the weapons and the military can be used just as efficiently and just as successfully from another perspective that perhaps at the moment we could hardly even imagine. And that the need for medicines enters into the relationship between man and nature, and the way in which light and sound resonate to remind each cell of the perfect design of its own intention and expression. We live now more and more within our higher centers. These create the way in which we can walk upon the earth, but our feet hardly touch the ground. That we can breathe, and there is space within our breath, and we can live intensely and fully, and there is lightness within our form, and we generate and regenerate in a way that we are friends with the earth, and we are ambassadors of the cosmos. Can we appreciate this then through the generations to come and know that there is no death, but the continuity of consciousness, and our memory remembers it all and go backwards and forwards, and always because it has a meaning here and now. What great gifts are there to awaken that will not give power or authority to one over anybody except over themselves? What great understanding is there to emerge within these themes as light, color, and sound deepen in their penetration and their upliftment, that we can live in a way that brings health and life into a system of planets where the earth is just an entry point, and we take our place within the civilizations and the cultures of space at a frequency which is far beyond the conflict and far more into the adventure of what can still be. For the definition of the Creator is that there is always more, and there is ever more opportunity to discover. So we hold these thoughts just a moment in the silence. thank you. Oh, yeah?
Well, one of the areas that interests us, myself and Elizabeth, is conflict transformation.
Yeah.
And that's applied sort of over the whole spectrum. The interest of it, our involvement doesn't spread over the whole thing. And I wonder how colour and sound can help in that kind of work. What kind of approach might we take towards maybe the more subtle use of light, colour and sound in helping this kind of thing along? Rather general sort of question.
Yeah. Now, first of all, we think we work with it from our own colour room, our own colour centre. And the next stage, I feel, is expanding the areas where we link directly into different areas of the world and different conditions and situations. We also link with people who are drawn to us, who come from these areas or represent them in some way. So we're not just trying to impose our solutions. We're always working with where there is a contact. So, for example, if you are connected with areas of conflict resolution or peace processes, you become our connectors. And through that we can already work with the areas to which you have already in some way become involved. And we might find that we're not all alone in doing this in our little colour room, you know. That we're part of a network of light that perhaps in a variety of ways, but essentially along the same theme, is asking for, at a subtle level, that the interdimensional connection can be anchored. And we are the anchor points here. The higher world enters in as we anchor the possibility through our own voluntary choice. So in a way we invite them, but we invite them into a space which is as strong and as well prepared and as consistent as we are able. That to me is the very first area. The second, with light and colour, is in the area of the dissemination of information. Now, I don't know how it is managed from another level, but those of us in some way that are interested in these ideas will meet people who make documentaries or who are going to develop programs of investigation or interviews or the bringing up of art and history and science that shows the pathways through the areas of culture and tradition that are in conflict in the world now. And information and education is absolutely a key. And to listen to people talk who don't look too different from us, whose way of talking is as enlightened as anybody that we know from our background, it's the encouragement of this that also comes through the nature of that we work with colour and sound. So we're not deliberately trying to work with it, we're embodying it. And the nature of our presence, we would then say, touches the atmosphere, and in that atmosphere other minds or other thoughts can enter the minds of people who are very capable but have not yet been very receptive. Now, it's never to try and influence somebody against their will or something like that. It always works where there is a receptivity, even though that it may be latent. So, working with light and colour and sound in our own way creates a certain presence. And we may not appreciate, but there is a network that works this way. So that although we're not always in the same room and we're not always thinking the same thoughts, at a soul level, we're absolutely are together. And in the areas where we belong to certain processes at work, we work in support of wherever it can be best used. It's like a resource, really. Now, The other area, of course, is in education. And first of all, with education, it's in environment. There's, in a little bit more perfect world, from our point of view here, we would want to work with environmental understanding in the nature of light and color. Our friend Carl Ryberg already begins to lecture and teach in this way. He's invited to conferences of industrial lighting to talk about what are the benefits of full spectrum lighting and what are the benefits of different colors in an environment. And it could be that we'll develop a way where environments can be changed. They can be stable within a certain light spectrum. They can be anchored within certain colors. But these colors can change every week or every month. And also where there are conferences, very important conferences, so then the actual quality of light is appreciated, and then also the way in which color can be introduced. So when it comes to education, it's almost like educating through the environment first. And in these environments, people are just more present and conscious and less stuck within their own agenda. Now, and then we go into education itself, and then with children, I think they already work a lot with light and color in a way, but if the environment is correct, the children are not under these neon lights that have a very aggressive spectrum. It will already make a difference. That there's no classroom that is near these very high tension cables, so that they're not disoriented in that way. And I think that will make a very big difference. And then, of course, you have to educate the educators, so that in the training schools, teachers' training schools, then we would also want to bring in a subject. It doesn't have to take dominance or predominance, like an ideology, just the importance of environment, of light, of air, of space, and that you don't have to make the window so high the students can't look out in case they dream. That there's plenty of light coming in, and let them dream away. And I think then the nature of the experience of the student will allow the higher centers to influence constructively, and the lower centers to be less into tribalism and all those strange territorial processes and areas of conflict. Now, then I think we get into the light and color in just health. We could say it's in medicine, but if we put it under the level of health, and then we begin to look to see how we live. Now they're having these energy bulbs which are supposed to be more friendly to the environment. I have misgivings about them. I don't feel comfortable with them myself. I don't know yet if it's my prejudice, actually. But it would be nice to see full spectrum, energy efficient lighting. And also color lamps that can change. You can just change your environment. We've already got one, which is made by Philips, where very simple method, and the complete color that comes out can change, and you can change the nature of the room. You can come in the room and say, oh, I think I'd like it in the green. Oh, no, I'd like it much more lighter, or a little bit deeper now. And I think these are environmental tools in a way, which will become commonplace, but we can work with them more and more. Now, I also think in our color room that as we go into our next stage, every time we know somebody that works in a hospital or in a mental institution or in a home that takes care of dementia and Alzheimer's, all these things, the halfway houses for people that have schizophrenia and they need to be in care, but they can also live in the community. We have a color link, light and color link to every single place that we possibly can through somebody that we know. We need to have a connection rather than just say, oh, this needs to be done, we'll fix them. There needs always to be an asking, a state of asking of some kind. And yeah, and then with this, I think this is the basis of it, really. It's education, and it's, in our way, making our contribution that is within a network that goes around the planet and that goes also through the spheres. We play our part even though we may not know exactly who else we are linking with enough. The individuals involved with this work become radiant, and in their environment, the environment becomes more receptive, absolutely. In doing information, which is like, I think it's like documentaries that we literally see and hear from every different culture, but we don't get stuck with reporting that gives us a point of view that does not enhance our global vision. It's the enhancement of global vision. And but also not to judge things from our own perspective. If we're going to look at Nigeria and everything that's happening there, it's not to judge it because we feel Europe is more civilized or something, but something, a completely different appreciation of being able to see through their eyes. And then in the environment, and then in the education. And I would see the way forward in a little capsule of those ideas at the moment. Yeah, and I hope they'll expand and develop, actually, very much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
sure.
That's very helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay.